Hey guys, welcome back. Here we are with lesson 10.3, which is going to focus on completing the square. And so notice our objective here at the bottom says that we're going to be forming a perfect square trinomial given a quadratic binomial. And if we remember, a trinomial has three terms. Okay, so a trinomial has three terms and a binomial has two terms. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be given two terms and we want to convert it into three terms. And before we do that, I want us to take a little bit of a look at chapter 9, again, a little of a review of what a perfect square trinomial even is and what it looks like. So here's an example of a perfect square trinomial, and we want to remember our rules of what makes something a perfect square trinomial. In order to be a perfect square trinomial, term 1 has to be a perfect square. So if we look here at our example, x squared would be term 1. And term 1 is in fact a perfect square because x times x makes a perfect square. Term 3 also has to be a perfect square. So if we look at term 3, in our example, term 3 is 25, and 25 is a perfect square because we can achieve 25 by doing 5 times 5. Term 2 was the trickiest part of a perfect square trinomial, so term 2 is derived from this formula. We always take 2 times the square root of term 1 times the square root of term 3. And that's how we come up with the second term in a perfect square trinomial. So in this example, we would take 2 times the square root of term 1 would be x, and the square root of term 3 would be 5. And then if we multiply those, we end up with 10x. And 10x is in fact what I have here for my second term. Okay, so this is how a perfect square trinomial is developed. And when we talk about completing the square in this lesson, we're talking about completing a perfect square trinomial. So let's go ahead. We have some examples here of two perfect square trinomials, and we're going to factor them. So think back to our factoring table. We've talked about that in chapter 10. It's also in the Google Classroom if you want to look at that. And so we're going to factor these perfect square trinomials, and we can either use our perfect square trinomial method or our working backwards method. I believe most of you are a little bit more comfortable with working backwards, so that's what we're going to take a look at. Remember, for working backwards, there is no coefficient in front of x squared, and then we need two numbers that add to our middle coefficient and that multiply to our third number. So for example B, we want two numbers that add to 20 and that multiply to 100. Okay, so let's take a look here at example A. I have x squared plus 6x plus 9. I want two numbers that add to 6 and that multiply to 9. My two numbers would be 3 and 3 because 3 times 3 equals 9 and 3 plus 3 equals 6. So I write my factors as x plus 3, x plus 3. So here would be my two factors. Now, if you notice, the factors are identical. When we have identical factors, we can rewrite them as x plus 3 squared. That squared just means that the factor, the same factor, shows up twice. And we are going to be focusing on this notation today, this x plus 3 squared notation. So get in the habit of writing that this way now. For example B, again, I want two numbers that add up to 20 and multiply to 10. So my numbers are going to be 10 and 10 because 10 times 10 gives me 100, and 10 plus 10 gives me 20. And I'm sorry, I forgot a 0 there on 100. So now I'm going to write my factors, x plus 10, x plus 10, and there are my factors. But if we notice in example B, just like in example A, my factors are identical. So I'm going to rewrite these factors as x plus 10 squared, the squared just meaning that the same exact factor shows up twice. In order to complete the square, we are going to be using these properties of our perfect square trinomial. And you're going to be asked to complete the square when you are only given two terms. And remember, two terms, we refer to that as a binomial. So that's why you're going to start with a binomial and you want to end up with a trinomial. So you're only given term 1 and term 2, and you want to find what that term 3 is going to be. So that's going to be our goal, to find term 3. All right, so look at this example. They are giving you term 1 in x squared, term 2 in 10x, and you want to find out what is that third term going to be. Notice for perfect square trinomials, there cannot be a number in front of x squared. So that x squared is not allowed to have a coefficient. Okay, of course there's an invisible 1 there, but no other coefficient is allowed. So let's look at how to actually complete the square. So when you're given these two terms, you're always going to start with x squared, and then you're going to have bx. Now b just represents a number, whatever number is there in front of x. But the rule for completing the square is to take that number that's in front of x, so take that b, divide it by 2, and then square it. So whatever number is in front of x, you divide it by 2 and then you square it, and you always add. So add that final result to the end of the binomial, and that will give you your third term. So let's take a look at our example here. X squared plus 10x. So what I have for b is the number 10. So let me apply that to my rule. So I'm going to take b divided by 2, so I'm going to take 10 divided by 2 and square it. Now 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So what do I do with that 25? I add it, notice we always add, to the end of my binomial, and there is my perfect square trinomial. So what we have just done, guys, is we just completed the square. In order to complete the square, we add 25 to the end. So here's another example. Let's go ahead and let's complete the square, but notice our directions now also want us to write this in factored form. So let's get started. What do I have for b in this situation? Notice that b equals -5. So let's apply my rule. I'm going to take -5 divided by 2 squared. -5 divided by 2 is -2.5 squared. And -2.5 is 6.25. So what do I do with that 6.25? I always take it and I add it. Whenever you complete the square, you are always adding. So you add it here to the end. So I have now completed my square. X squared minus 5x plus 6.25 is me completing this square. Okay, so let me rewrite that. X squared minus 5x plus 6.25. Okay, now we need to write this in factored form. So factored form means we need to break it down and write this in parentheses. Okay, so go back to working backwards. We need two numbers that add to -5 and that multiply to 6.25. Now this one's a little bit trickier because we have a decimal. So it's going to be a little bit harder for us to think of. But I'm going to give you guys a trick. The factor will always be the b divided by 2. So notice, what did b divided by 2 give us in this example? Let me erase some of this so that I can draw. But b divided by 2 in this example was negative 2.5. So let me test that out. If I do negative 2.5 plus negative 2.5, I get negative 5, which is what I want. If I get negative 2.5 times negative 2.5, I get positive 6.25, which is also what I want to multiply to. So my two factors are going to be x minus 2.5, x minus 2.5. And then, since they are the same factor, I'm going to rewrite them here as x minus 2.5 squared. And so here, guys, we have the completed square right here in my blue box, x squared minus 5x plus 6.25. That would answer the first part of the directions, complete the square. And then here at the bottom, I have my factored form, x minus 2.5 squared. This slide is a little bit long, but we're going to have an example on the next slide that goes through all of these steps. So just kind of stick with me here as we go through them. Try to focus on the steps, and we'll put them all into play on the next slide. So if we remember from our last lesson, vertex form looks like this. Y equals x minus h squared plus k. And so in order to change to vertex form, we're going to start with our perfect square trinomial, and I want to put the x terms in parentheses. So the x terms are my first two terms, okay, because my third term is always a number by itself, a constant. Once I have those x terms in parentheses, I complete the square inside the parentheses. And remember, when we're completing the square, we always add. But then in step 3, something that's very important in algebra is keeping the balance of an equation. So in step 3, since I added inside the parentheses, I subtract that same number on the outside of the parentheses. So notice step 3 is the complete opposite of step 2 in order to keep the balance. In step 2, you add on the inside. In step 3, you subtract on the outside. And then our final step, step 4, is just to simplify to vertex form. So I know that might seem a little confusing, but let's go to our next slide where we can put all these steps into practice. So here we go. Let's go ahead and practice with all of these steps here. Rewrite y equals x squared minus 8x plus 7 in the form y equals parentheses x minus h squared plus k. And remember, this y equals x minus h squared plus k, this is our vertex form. Okay, so we want to turn a regular quadratic equation into vertex form. So let me start with step 1. Put the x terms in parentheses. So notice in front of my x squared and after my 8x, I put parentheses. So I have done step 1. For step 2, complete the square inside the parentheses and make sure that we add. So we're going to do step 2 now. To complete the square, I take that b, so I'm going to take negative 8 divided by 2 squared. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and negative 4 squared is 16. So what do I do with that 16? I'm going to add it here inside of the parentheses. So now for step 2, this is what I have. Y equals x squared minus 8x plus 16. This is how I just completed the square. And then I keep that plus 7 on the outside. So notice that we have now done step 2. I have completed the square inside the parentheses and I added. Now let's go to step 3. Step 3 says to subtract the same number on the outside. So what number did I add on the inside? I added 16. So that means I'm now going to subtract 16 outside of the parentheses. So now for step 3, I have y equals x squared minus 8x, and then I did plus 16 inside of the parentheses. So that means outside of the parentheses, I now have to do minus 16. And if you guys can see, this is just keeping the equation balanced, okay? Everything in algebra is about balance. So if we add 16 inside the parentheses, now we have completed step 3 and subtracted on the outside of the parentheses. So our final step, step 4, is just going to be to simplify this to vertex form. So in order to simplify to vertex form, notice I'm going to want to factor my x squared minus 8x plus 16. So if I were to factor that, two numbers that add to negative 8 and that multiply to 16, I would get x minus 4, x minus 4. And so how I'm going to write my final answer, I'm going to put y equals x minus 4 squared, because my same factor shows up twice, and then I just simplify my numbers. 7 minus 16 gives me negative 9. And so here we have our final answer at the bottom. To rewrite my original equation in vertex form, here it is. Y equals x minus 4 squared minus 9. So well done with that, guys. I know that was a little bit tricky, okay, but hopefully you stuck through it with me. And now let's see why it's so important to put these equations in vertex form. If we remember from our previous lessons, vertex form gives us a lot of information. So here in 3b, the second part of this question, notice here's my equation that we came up with, right? We just did this on the last slide. And using the vertex form that we discovered in example 3a, what is the vertex of the parabola? And if we remember back to our past lessons, the vertex always comes from h and k. So if I have y equals a, x minus h squared plus k, the vertex comes from h and k. So what do I have for h here? I have minus 4. And what do I have for k here? I have minus 9. Now remember, for vertex form, the h is always going to be the opposite, and the k is always going to be the same. So my final vertex is going to be positive 4, because the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4, and then the y part is going to be negative 9. So this here at the bottom would be my vertex, and remember that is an ordered pair on a coordinate grid. So if I wanted to graph that, I could. I would go 4, and then I would go down 9. So this would be my vertex. Okay, guys? And that's why getting equations into vertex form is so important, because it gives us a lot of really valuable information. And that is it for our lesson here in 10.3. Okay, I'm going to show you what the homework will look like here in a second, but I do want to remind you guys there is no new lesson tomorrow, so there won't be a new video or a new recording, but your quiz review is already posted in Google Classroom. Okay, we are going to have a timed quiz within Google Classroom on Monday, April 6th. The entire quiz will be multiple choice, but that doesn't mean it's easy, okay? You still have to know what you're doing. So here's the homework for 10.3, okay? They'll ask you to complete the square first, so won't be as tricky here, just to factor. This is the bottom of your homework here, 10.3, just going through and again completing the square. Now this is what your review is going to look like. Again, the review is already posted. All right, guys, if you go into Google Classroom, under the Chapter 10 Quiz tab, you will find this review, and it is a homework assignment to complete this, so make sure you complete the review and you submit that within Google Classroom. As you should be familiar with, our reviews are very similar to the actual quiz and to the actual test. So if you can complete this review with confidence and understand what you're doing, then you're prepared for the quiz. Okay, so go back here, all these steps. Remember, our quiz is going to cover all of the lessons that we've done so far, so 10.1 to 10.3, everything that we've learned will be on the quiz. Notice the review has a few of these solving equation problems, and then the last part is the hardest part of the quiz, okay? You are going to be asked to do this on the quiz. Even though it is multiple choice, you're going to have to go through all of these steps, okay? So please take this part of the quiz review seriously. I'll post the answer key here at a separate time and we'll go over all of that together. And again, if you have any questions, please post those in Google Classroom. But please make sure, go through the 10.3 homework, go through the Chapter 10 quiz review. Okay, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time and for our quiz